Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We've been gone for a couple weeks doing some things. Dr. Pino's having some interesting changes in his professional life, but it seems to be moving forward as I have been as well. So we are now back. It's getting hot here in Arizona, so it's time to talk about interesting things because it's also pretty hot in our political arena out there, in particular on TV with the Trump trials. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. Correct, Doctor? Welcome back, first off.
Thank you very much, Vince. It's really a pleasure to be back and uh, kind of with renewed energy and motivation into getting back into trying to give something back in terms of knowledge, in terms of understanding of processes and behaviors, and all of those wonderful things. And as you said, we're going to be talking about um, the trial, right? The trial
Mhm.
of the century. Let's call it that, even though the century is fairly young.
I thought that was
Um,
the OJ trial back in the day, but actually it's a new century. Trial of the new century. That would do. We'll go there.
Oh, the first president is try, right? And
Yes.
what I find fascinating, and I actually published an article today on Medium on my blog about this particular issue, and is that we have gotten to know our past president quite well because of his behavior, because of his tendencies, because of his frustration, his defensiveness. Um, since 2016, right? More than what we knew about him before.
Hmm.
And for us in my business in psychiatry and in psychology, his behavior is very predictable, right? And this morning I was thinking about writing this blog, and I was thinking about looking at some of the things that I'm reading in the news about his behavior and his whatever he's reacting and things of that sort. And it got into my mind the idea of let's talk about narcissism in the context of predictability,
Mm.
right? Because most of the time we are reactive to people's narcissism, and instead of being proactive by recognizing it and anticipating behavior, right? Because what happens, I see this with the media a lot, and media is something interesting because I don't know if they just don't learn from experience or it is just more profitable to keep repeating the same thing over and over and over again. Because why are news people surprised for what
Yeah.
they're seeing, right?
Well, as we've talked, first off, what you said first is really important. People forget this is an historic event. No
Yes.
former president has ever been brought to trial for criminal civil issues ever. I mean, at least to this level. And this has multiple counts against him potentially, and multiple lawsuits. That is truly an historic event. And two, we forget often because it's morphed over the years. Back in the day, television, when it first started in the 50s, was originally conceived to educate people. And then, of course, it rapidly turned into something simply by educating them. But then, really, the media has moved in the last, 20, 30 years to be really big business, really big money. So they adjust the content in order to gather viewership because they're losing. Otherwise, they're going to lose all the cable networks and everything else. There's other options for entertainment, so you have to make news more entertaining, and that's what they're going for. So yeah, I would think that if tomorrow they put a thing about his trial and everybody ignored it, they would change. But until then, they're just going to keep repeating for those viewership.
And you know what happens is that when we look at the individual, whether it's our past president or an individual that suffers from narcissism, there are some basic core issues that narcissists defend against, right? And one of the most common one, and this is true for all human beings, because we all have narcissistic features. Being narcissistic is being normal.
Could you please? I don't interrupt you, but could you please, for our audience, just review what narcissism is? Because it's the term is bantied around so much now.
Narcissism is, in the psychiatric context, is an illness, meaning it's a disorder. And it's a disorder that is manifested by a very aloof, grandiose, uh, disconnected, okay, persona that does not have the ability to exercise empathy or to recognize other people as people, right?
Mm.
So in psychodynamic terms, we're talking about objects. So people become objects for them, and they're objects of either gratification or rejection. So
Okay.
what you see in somebody who is narcissistic is this grandiose, aloof, distant behavior that you're better than everybody else. Okay. Now that's extreme because we all can be like that.
Hmm.
And as we have talked before, normalcy includes some degree of narcissism because we have to have some sense of value. Most people will not manifest those narcissistic features uh, because it's not necessary, right? But if you get injured or shamed, you may react in narcissistic ways, okay? And the way the narcissist reacts to injury, meaning shame, being rejected, being criticized, being diminished, is by becoming more grandiose and more aggressive.
Mm.
And aggressive most of the time in behavioral ways, either verbally or posturing, but they can be physically aggressive. So a lot of perpetrators of domestic violence are very vulnerable people. Now, what is important to recognize is that the individual who is manifesting significant narcissistic behaviors underneath is a very empty individual. So how do you grow to be a narcissist is usually the result of neglect and rejection as a child, right?
Mm.
So narcissistic, well, let me take that back. All personality traits are the result of experience, right? So if you consistently grow up in an environment where you're consistently rejected and criticized, you may develop narcissistic traits. You may develop other traits like antisocial traits or borderline traits, but how you move depends on what environment you're growing in, right?
Mm.
So we become who we are as individuals based on our genetics, our experience, okay, and our ability to relate to people. So, in that context, if we go back to the idea that a narcissist um, is a very empty individual that is trying to defend him or herself by expressing his ideal idea of self, right? Meaning, I am this grandiose person, but you internally know that you're not, maybe unconsciously know that you're not as good as you think you are. So any criticism, any
Mm.
potential shame throws you completely off the mark.
And that allows us to predict their behaviors.
Well, once you know that somebody has those traits, the behaviors are very predictable, and that's true for all personalities.
Okay.
I mean, whether you have borderline personality, antisocial personality, or you have obsessive compulsive or dependent personality, what personality disorder means is that your behavior is predictable under certain circumstances, right? So somebody with narcissistic traits will predictably react in certain ways, right? Especially situations where you're cornered or
Hmm.
you're shamed. So when we talk about this particular individual and we talk about the person being cornered and being shamed,
Which is what's exactly happening.
exactly.
So,
So the
so what
behavior is
behaviors
predictable.
could we expect, or should we expect?
Well, I mean, there's different levels of response, and the most common is denial, right?
Mm.
I didn't do this. Or start projecting and deflecting, meaning it's not me, it's them. And
Mm.
how many times have we heard this individual do that in the last 7 years, right? So many, 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 many times. Now, it's just that when he's cornered and he's potentially shamed, you can see the reaction that is almost immediate, right? I mean, I remember one of the debates that he had with Hillary Clinton. You remember that Hillary Clinton told him, "You're a Russian puppet."
Hmm.
And even without thinking, his reaction was, "No, you're the puppet. You're the puppet." That's a typical deflection, right? I mean, no rationale, no logic, no explanation. I cannot be the puppet. You're the puppet.
So does
So,
that mean all little kids are narcissists? Because that's how they talk.
so are you saying that our past president behaves like a child?
Mm, seems
Well,
that way to me.
yes. You see, when you see children between the ages of 2 to 4, 5, okay, I mean, do you remember the terrible twos? Kids in between the age of 2 and 3 are basically tremendously narcissistic, borderline antisocial.
Interesting.
He's just me, 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 me. And it gets to the point that it's almost funny, to see a kid. And I mean, you see in the supermarket all the time, mommy's kind of telling the kid, put that candy down, you're not having it, and the kid's crying, right? And the mom tells him again, put the candy back, we're not buying it. And the kid says, which candy?
Hmm.
And he's got the candy in his hand, right? So those kinds of things you may see in people as they grow older, if they got stuck in those periods of development, right? And again, neglect and abuse from parents, which we may look at the history of this individual he may have sustained, kind of feed into those things. Now, that's not the only thing. I mean, also your temperament, your genetics, and some other things, right?
So that immediate deflection and defensiveness are some of the behaviors we can expect. But what else are you
Well,
anticipating,
you see,
observing, or
if you
have
go to the
observed?
next level and you're pushing things a little too hard, where there's no room for them to walk away, then you start seeing behaviors that are more along the lines of grandstanding,
Hmm.
right? Utilize your intelligence and your presence in a way that you are basically trying to get the attention of other people. I mean, you already deflected. Now you want the attention in a positive way. Okay. And then you end up getting the attention by you becoming the victim.
That is pretty common as well for this individual, always being the victim.
Yeah. So you kind of, and he's a master at doing this. And I don't
Hmm.
think that he does it consciously, just that's his modus operandi in terms of unconscious behavior. He starts manipulating things. Okay. And sometimes when he's under a lot of pressure, he does it in ways that are very concrete, where he basically presents himself as a hero that trapped.
Mm-hmm.
So you hear it during the hearings. This is Biden utilizing the powers of the government to destroy me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's a basically, um, on one hand, grandstanding, because you're saying I'm important enough and problematic enough that these people want to get rid of me. Okay, so I'm the hero and I'm being victimized.
And that definitely is the perception that his followers have of him. They really think he's the flag waving hero of the United States instead of somebody who's challenging our greatest precepts. And the real ironic thing is the people who previous to this, who seem to keep the Constitution close to their heart, are really just bypassing it in favor of this one individual.
Well, you see, what happens is that those people that are normal and that are empathic, um, are vulnerable to these people, because when they present themselves in a grandiose, grandstanding hero victim position, you feel a need to rescue them.
Hmm. Interesting.
So these people are being contagious. This is a contagion of the grandiosity. I'm part of you, and I can do something to help you.
Hmm.
Right. So from that perspective, it becomes important that people recognize that he's not the victim, right? Because once he presents himself as a victim and you believe that, you feel a need to help,
Hmm. And
okay,
defend.
and
And
defend.
defend.
You
Interesting.
identify with them, right?
Now, you said something interesting a minute ago that he does it unconsciously. So, Again, as you have said in the past, you've never had a chance to examine him, and the things I've read about him and the people I know who know him said his father was very, very critical and abusive, and then he was also thrown to a mentor, I believe, Mr. Cohen, who is notorious for basically using narcissism and every political means and media means to win at all costs. So do you think this is his character, or was he programmed to be this way and he's following that, or is it a mixture of both?
Well, I think that I've never evaluated Mr. Trump, so I really can't give you a psychiatric opinion about that. So my educated opinion about what I've observed him as a public figure, what I've read and what I've known about his history, he seems to have been very capable, okay, of learning from the wrong people, like Mr.
Mm,
Cohen, right? Mr. Cohen was probably um, Mr. Trump uh, three times, right? And he was a master of it, right?
oh yeah.
And he ended up even at the end, he ended up in disgrace. He never recognized any of his mistakes, which brings me to another issue, which is the lack of remorse, right? I mean, they can never be wrong.
Hmm.
And from that perspective, I think that Mr. Trump is manifesting these behaviors, and it's a combination of um, the shame avoidance, yeah, utilizing all his tools, but getting to a point of being forced into a very childish, tantruming behavior that we're starting to see in the trial, where he goes into the trial, we get some news from the, and then he walks out and he's basically throwing a tantrum in front of the press.
Mm,
And I anticipate that that's going to get worse,
okay, because
right?
it also isn't there some? I mean, aren't there some gag orders on him and things like that? I mean, he'll be
Well,
legally risking
what
some things
happens,
as well.
yeah, well, what happens is that and it took me a long time to learn this in the United States because I mean, even though I'm a U.S. citizen since I was born, I didn't come here until I was in my early 20s, full time. And I learned something that was very humbling to me. And that happened when I started doing forensic psychiatry, and I had my own narcissistic issues in terms of I'm a doctor, I know better, you should listen to me. And I learned how much power judges have,
Mm,
right? Um, and I learned very early in my career to respect that because our Constitution and our laws are built in a way that there are very few people that have as much power as judges. Okay. Um, more than presidents, more than legislators. Okay. When it comes to the law, that little courtroom that belongs to us and that's being represented by the judge and the jury, right, has tremendous power. It doesn't matter who you are.
mm.
Now, who you are may allow you to play with it, to buy attorneys and buy appeals and spend money in ways that other people cannot do, right? So it's not that the law is wrong, is that it's not that you bind the law, it's that you can buy more processes. And those
Yeah,
processes allow you to extend things and get away with things and so on.
which was a Cohen tactic for many, many, many moons that the Trump organizations use. You delay, delay,
Exactly.
delay, and the moment you're about to lose, you settle out
Mhm.
of court. So you never have to accept blame, and never have to say you're guilty, never be declared guilty, but get out of the issue. If you can't spend them, you just buy them out, basically.
Somebody like Mr. Trump, who is dealing with all kinds of different charges, different things, and things that he may be guilty of, things that he may not guilty of, is going to be up to juries to decide that. Most people who are not dealing with narcissistic issues would settle this.
Mm.
And there was a time, if you look at his history, when most cases, when things got to a certain point, he always settled,
Would
whether
always settle.
the university and these things. But when it got down to after his presidency, something happened that he stopped settling, right? So now he got $480 million in one charge with civil, and then 100 and some, well, 90 million from another one, you know. So I think that the presidency worsened the narcissism because at a certain point it sounds like he believes
Hmm.
it's no longer just a defense, but it's a quasi, I think, delusional situation where he feels both trapped, right? But he believes that he's different. He is, I don't know, a second coming of Jesus or something like that, right? So when you start drinking your own Kool-Aid about your own behavior, you miss the perspective, right? So it is a dangerous game, I think, for a narcissist to get into this point because it becomes an all or nothing
Hmm.
situation, which means that you have the right to be better, you have the right to be different, and that should bring recognition and admiration from the rest of the world, and that should never be shamed. So that is bordering on a problematic behavior for somebody with narcissistic traits.
So one of the questions that comes up concerning his trials, and you hear the lawyer's side always saying he should never, 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 but it sounds like he might, and that's testify in his own behalf. How would you anticipate something like that going?
Well, I anticipate the behaviors to continue, right? Um, and I think that there is a um, competition right now of power between a past president and a judge, right? In which the narcissistic traits make it disadvantageous for the past president because it doesn't seem like the judge is dealing with narcissistic issues,
Hmm.
right? So you get back to the issue of purpose. And I understand that there's politics involved and that he wants to be president again, and he wants to rail the base and all those practical things. But at the end of the day, it becomes paradoxical. It becomes to the point that people will stop recognizing you as a victim. People will stop recognizing you're better than other people. And the only one who believes that is you.
Mm.
And you're starting to see some of that when you start seeing that there's not a lot of big crowds outside of the court. There
Yep.
are not big crowds in a lot of different places. So there's a high degree of fatigue. And that's what happens with narcissists, either in the political arena or in the personal arena. You get tired of them.
You
It
know,
is
it's
so intense.
interesting you say that because I mean we live in Arizona, which is a pretty pro-Trump state, and I've seen a decline in the flags and the this and that and the grandiosity. And even in my other workplace, where quite a few people are Republicans and conservatives, one person in particular, he said, "You know what?" And they tried to defend him. I believe a lot of the things he says, and I'm like, okay. He says, but he's too divisive for this country, and I will never vote for him. And
Well, you see what,
these are Republicans saying this, which is
and I've
interesting.
seen this in cults. I've treated people who've been in cults in the past or who have been successful at escaping the cult. And one major issue that also has to do with narcissism is that these people are ashamed of recognizing, okay, that they were wrong.
Yeah. Well, that's what's going to be my next question. What do you do with the people who are the victims of narcissists? Because I do. I have people I know who are so neck deep in believing this guy that they couldn't possibly pull out without some narcissistic degree of their own. How does one manage that? How should they maybe approach it? Help
Well,
them.
the best way to approach people who have been in the cult, right, is to not shame them because of it. So that's step number one. I mean, the worst thing you can do is that how can you be so stupid to fall into those ideas, right?
Mhm.
So you open your arms and you invite people to come to you, right? And to say, okay, I understand that it's difficult to be in a situation like that. How can I help? And let them guide you. Because if we are to be successful at helping people move away from the extremes, and that goes for both sides, left and right, in order to help them move away from that, we have to be given the space, okay, the safety and the freedom to take risks, right? Walking away from a cult is a risk, and people, we are all risk averse, right? So how do we help somebody, you know, to close their eyes and walk slowly and let them know they're not going to fall, right? And that if necessary, if they allow you, you can catch them,
Mm.
right? Because the worst thing that we can do is to keep rejecting people and keeping people at the extremes. So, and I'm going to mention something because I think it was really fascinating. And I think that we're not paying enough attention to this. But this last weekend, there was a vote to provide help financially to Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, right? $95 billion. And something really fascinating happening is that a good chunk of Democrats and a good chunk of Republicans got together and supported it. And the Democrats actually came back and say, well, there's this extreme right who wants to get rid of the Speaker of the House for a second time, but they didn't do it because their Democratic votes are going to prevent that from happening.
Mm.
So here's where you see how can the extreme position of the right of the Republican Party paradoxically help the Congress to get bipartisan for a short period of time. So the question is, can we learn to utilize the extremes instead of pulling everybody to the extremes to use the paradox to help the middle? And I think that was a fascinating thing from a psychological psychiatric perspective.
Well, our country has done that in the past.
Yeah,
After the Civil War, that was one of the things I remember being discussed in history class. And say, what was the big issue? It's like, how do we not continue to victimize them, or at least see them as the enemy, to
yeah,
re-engage them as Americans? And I agree with you. That's been, as a staunch independent myself, that's always been my issues with both extremes. Is now we've become right left, those binary choices against it. No, we're all American first, and make those decisions based on that. Well, Doctor, once again, really appreciate the input. Hopefully, I'll be able to read your article. There's going to be another one out on just general narcissism, probably two very soon. And we'll hopefully see you all again next week.
hey, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with everybody and especially with you. So we'll try to meet again next week.
Wonderful.